Black musician's song exposes hidden generational stories. The old man's hands trembled as he gripped the sides of the podium, his weathered face illuminated by the harsh spotlight. James Wilson, once a renowned jazz pianist, stared out at the sea of faces in the dimly lit auditorium. His song, a melody he'd written 50 years ago, played softly in the background as he struggled to find words. "That song was never meant to be heard," James said, his voice cracking. "It contains truths that were buried for a reason." In the front row, an elderly white man slowly rose to his feet, leaning heavily on a cane. Thomas Morgan's face was pale, eyes wide with recognition. "James Wilson," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "That melody, I know where it came from." James's daughter Sarah rushed toward the stage, confusion written across her face. "Dad, what's happening? What does he mean?" Marcus Wilson, James's son, stepped between his father and Thomas, protective instinct taking over. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but he knows exactly who I am," Thomas interrupted, tears welling in his eyes. "Don't you, James? Tell them who I really am." The crowd murmured as tension filled the air. James's wife Elaine clutched her chest, shaking her head in silent warning. Rebecca Morgan, Thomas's daughter and the music producer who had rediscovered James's song, stood frozen in disbelief. James closed his eyes, 50 years of carefully guarded secrets threatening to spill out. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Thomas. "You're my brother," James said, the words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the audience. Marcus stepped back as if physically struck. Sarah covered her mouth in shock. Elaine began to sob quietly. "Half-brother," Thomas corrected, his voice breaking. "Same father, different mothers, different lives, different races, but the same blood." Rebecca staggered backward. "Dad, what are you saying? That means, but let's go back to how this all started," James said, addressing the stunned audience. It was just 3 hours earlier when James Wilson sat in his living room, fingers hovering over the yellowed keys of his upright piano. At 72, his hands weren't as nimble as they once were, arthritis making each movement a small negotiation with pain. Still, muscle memory guided him through the opening bars of a melody he hadn't played in decades. "I haven't heard that one in a long time," Elaine said, entering the room with 2 cups of tea. At 69, she moved with deliberate grace, her silver-streaked hair pulled back in a loose bun. James stopped playing abruptly. "Just came to mind, that's all." Elaine set his tea on a coaster atop the piano. "That song was always special to you. Never understood why you didn't include it on any of your albums." "Some things aren't meant to be shared," James replied, closing the piano lid gently. Their modest home in Philadelphia was filled with memories, photographs of their children growing up, awards from James's music career, souvenirs from the few vacations they'd managed during leaner years. A framed poster from James's heyday in the 1970s hung on the wall, showing a younger version of himself seated at a grand piano, the words "James Wilson Quartet" emblazoned across the bottom. The doorbell rang, and Elaine went to answer it. Their son Marcus stood on the porch, dressed in a crisp button-down shirt and slacks, his lawyer's briefcase in hand. "There he is," James called out. "The big-shot attorney deigns to visit his old folks." Marcus smiled, embracing his mother before setting his briefcase down. At 44, he had his father's height and his mother's gentle eyes, though years of corporate law had added premature lines to his forehead. "Sorry I'm late," Marcus said. "Had to finish up some paperwork before the weekend." "You worked too hard," Elaine chided, patting his cheek. "Sarah called earlier. She'll meet us at the event." Marcus nodded, then turned to his father. "You ready for tonight, Dad?" It's not every day a song you wrote 50 years ago gets celebrated at the Philadelphia Music Heritage Foundation. James grimaced. "Still don't understand why they chose that particular song. Wrote dozens better ones." "According to the producer, it's the raw emotional authenticity that resonates with modern audiences," Marcus said, making air quotes. "Plus, apparently it's gone viral on TikTok." "Tick what?" James grumbled. "Kids these days finding meaning in something they know nothing about." Elaine placed a hand on her husband's shoulder. "It's an honor, James, your music touching a new generation." The tension in James's shoulders didn't ease. "What time do we need to leave?" "Car's coming in an hour," Marcus replied, checking his watch. "The producer wants to meet with you before the ceremony. Rebecca Morgan, she's quite respected in the industry." James nodded absently, his mind elsewhere. "Think I'll rest a bit before we go." As James disappeared into the bedroom, Marcus turned to his mother. "Is he okay? He seems off," Elaine sighed. "That song has always been a sore spot. He wrote it before we met back in '68, never talks about it." "Strange that it's the one getting all the attention now," Marcus mused. Life has a funny way of bringing things full circle, Elaine said, her voice carrying a hint of worry. Sometimes whether we want it to or not. Rebecca Morgan adjusted her glasses as she reviewed the evening's program. At 53, she had built a reputation for rediscovering forgotten musical gems and bringing them to new audiences. Her latest project, a compilation album featuring overlooked songs from black musicians of the 1960s and 70s, had unexpectedly produced a viral hit. "Everything on schedule?" she asked her assistant. "Yes, Ms. Morgan. The Wilson family should arrive within the hour. The technical team has the original recording ready to play, and the student jazz ensemble will perform their interpretation afterward." Rebecca nodded, satisfaction warming her chest. "Perfect, and my father? Mr. Morgan is already here. He's waiting in the VIP lounge." Rebecca smiled. Her father rarely attended her professional events. At 80, Thomas Morgan preferred the comfort of his suburban home to the bustle of the city. But when she'd mentioned James Wilson's name, he'd insisted on coming. "It's been over 50 years, he'd said on the phone, his voice uncharacteristically emotional. "I need to be there." Rebecca made her way to the VIP lounge, where her father sat alone, staring at the program notes. Thomas Morgan had once been an imposing figure, a successful business owner who had provided Rebecca and her late mother with a comfortable upper-middle-class life. Now age had bent his tall frame, and his once sharp blue eyes were clouded with cataracts. "Dad," Rebecca said, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" Thomas looked up, blinking as if returning from a distant memory. "Just thinking about the old days. 1968 was a lifetime ago." Rebecca sat beside him. "You never told me you knew James Wilson." "Knew of him," Thomas corrected too quickly. "Philadelphia music scene was smaller back then. Everyone knew everyone." Rebecca studied her father's face, sensing there was more to the story. "Well, you'll get to meet him properly tonight. His song, Blood Memory, is the centerpiece of the celebration." Thomas's hand trembled slightly as he set down the program. "That's what they're calling it now? Blood Memory?" "That's what it was labeled on the master tape we found in the archives," Rebecca explained. "Though apparently Wilson never gave it an official title when he recorded it. It was just untitled composition, July 1968. Thomas nodded slowly. "July 1968, right after." "After what?" "After Martin Luther King was assassinated," Thomas said, his voice distant. "Terrible time, the country was on fire." Rebecca squeezed her father's hand. "I'm glad you're here, it means a lot to me." Thomas's eyes, suddenly clear and intense, locked onto hers. "There are things you don't know, Rebecca, things I should have told you long ago." Before Rebecca could respond, her assistant appeared at the door. "Ms. Morgan, the Wilsons have arrived." Rebecca stood, professional instincts taking over. "We'll talk later, Dad." As she walked away, Thomas called after her. "Rebecca, the song, it wasn't just about the times, it was about us." Rebecca paused, confusion furrowing her brow, but the demands of the event pulled her forward. Her father's cryptic comment would have to wait. James's hands gripped the sides of the podium, his face illuminated by the harsh spotlight. The song, the melody he'd written 50 years ago, played softly in the background as he struggled to find words. "That song was never meant to be heard," James said, his voice cracking. "It contains truths that were buried for a reason." Thomas slowly rose to his feet again, leaning heavily on his cane. His face was pale, eyes wide with recognition. "James Wilson," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the suddenly silent room. "That melody, I know where it came from." Sarah rushed toward the stage, confusion written across her face. "Dad, what's happening? What does he mean?" Marcus stepped between his father and Thomas, protective instinct taking over. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but he knows exactly who I am," Thomas interrupted, tears welling in his eyes. "Don't you, James, tell them who I really am." The crowd murmured as tension filled the air. Elaine clutched her chest, shaking her head in silent warning. Rebecca stood frozen in disbelief. James closed his eyes, 50 years of carefully guarded secrets threatening to spill out. When he opened them again, he looked directly at Thomas. "You're my brother," James said, the words hanging in the air like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the audience. Marcus stepped back as if physically struck. Sarah covered her mouth in shock. Elaine began to sob quietly. "Half-brother," Thomas corrected, his voice breaking. "Same father, different mothers, different lives, different races, but the same blood." Rebecca staggered backward. "Dad, what are you saying? That means—" "It means," James said, finding strength in finally speaking the truth, "that Edwin Morgan, Thomas's father, a white man who owned half the real estate in North Philadelphia, was also my father, though he never acknowledged me publicly." The revelation hung in the air, the implications rippling through the room. This wasn't just family drama, it was American history, the complicated legacy of race and identity laid bare. The song, James continued, his voice steadier now, came from the day I finally confronted Edwin Morgan, demanded he acknowledge me as his son. It was a week after Martin Luther King was killed. The city was still smoldering from the riots, and I was done living in the shadows. Philadelphia, July 1968, the office of Edwin Morgan Real Estate Development occupied the entire top floor of one of the few modern buildings in downtown Philadelphia. James Wilson, 22 years old and burning with purpose, wore his only suit, the one he performed in with his quartet at the Blue Note Jazz Club. The receptionist, a young white woman with a beehive hairdo, looked up in surprise as James approached her desk. "Can I help you?" she asked, her smile professional but her eyes wary. "I'm here to see Edwin Morgan," James said, forcing his voice to remain steady. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but he'll want to see me. Tell him Loretta Wilson's son is here." The receptionist's eyebrows rose slightly, but she picked up the phone and murmured into it. After a moment, she looked up at James. "Mr. Morgan says he's in a meeting. If you'd like to make an appointment, tell him I'm not leaving," James interrupted. "Tell him I'll sit here all day if I have to. Tell him I'll be back tomorrow and the next day until he sees me." The receptionist's smile vanished. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave or I'll call security." "It's all right, Miss Parker," a male voice said. James turned to see a young white man in an expensive suit standing in a doorway. He was perhaps a few years older than James, with the same strong jawline and high forehead that James saw every morning in the mirror. "Thomas Morgan," the man said, extending his hand. "My father's in a meeting, but perhaps I can help you." James stared at the outstretched hand for a long moment before taking it. "James Wilson, I need to speak with your father. It's personal." Something in James's tone made Thomas study him more carefully. "Wilson, did you say your mother is Loretta Wilson?" James nodded, surprised. "You know her?" A flicker of understanding crossed Thomas's face. "I've heard the name." He glanced at the receptionist, who was watching them curiously. "Come with me." Thomas led James down a hallway lined with framed photographs of buildings, the Morgan real estate empire that dominated much of Philadelphia. He ushered James into a small conference room and closed the door. "My father doesn't have any meetings today," Thomas said directly. "He just doesn't want to see you." James's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Why?" "Because he knows exactly who I am." Thomas sighed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Look, I don't know what your angle is." "My angle," James interrupted, his voice rising. "My angle is that Edwin Morgan has been paying my mother hush money for 22 years. My angle is that he's my father, same as he's yours, except he acknowledges you and pretends I don't exist." Thomas's face paled. That's not possible." "Ask him," James challenged. "Ask him about Loretta Wilson, who cleaned this office building at night. Ask him about the affair that went on for years. Ask him about the son he's never once spoken to." Thomas shook his head, but doubt had crept into his expression. "My father wouldn't what? Sleep with a black woman, or wouldn't abandon his own child because of the color of his skin." The door opened, and an older man entered, tall, distinguished, with silver hair and the same jawline that both younger men shared. Edwin Morgan's expression was cold, his posture rigid with barely controlled anger. "That's enough," he said sharply. "Thomas, leave us." Thomas looked between his father and James, confusion and dawning realization battling on his face. "Father is what he's saying. I said leave us," Edwin repeated, his tone brooking no argument. After Thomas had gone, Edwin closed the door and turned to face James. "Whatever you want, you won't get it by making scenes in my office." James stood his ground. "I don't want your money. I want you to acknowledge me as your son." Edwin's laugh was bitter. "And why would I do that? Your mother accepted our arrangement years ago." "My mother was a 16-year-old girl when you started with her," James said, disgust evident in his voice. "She didn't have much choice in any arrangement." "That's ancient history," Edwin dismissed with a wave of his hand. "And if you're thinking of some kind of legal claim or public accusation, think again. No one would believe you, and I have very good lawyers." James stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "Martin Luther King is dead, cities are burning, and men like you still think you can own people, own their silence, own their dignity." "Don't bring politics into this," Edwin warned. "It's always been political," James fired back. "Your son Thomas and I were born in the same year to women you were involved with at the same time, but he got your name, your privilege, your acknowledgement. And what did I get? Secret payments and a life of pretending my father was dead." Something flickered in Edwin's eyes, not guilt exactly, but perhaps a moment of recognition. "What do you want from me, James, really? I told you, acknowledgement. Tell Thomas the truth. Tell your family. I'm not asking to be in your will or for a place at your table. I just want the truth to be spoken, finally." Edwin straightened his tie, his businessman's mask sliding back into place. That's not going to happen. Now I think we're done here. James didn't move. We're not done, not by a long shot. Are you threatening me? I'm promising you, James said, his voice deadly calm. The truth doesn't stay buried forever. One day it will come out, and you'll have to face it, same as I have my whole life. Edwin moved to the door and opened it. Miss Parker will see you out. Don't come back, James, for your mother's sake, if not your own. Later that night, James sat at the piano in his apartment, the confrontation replaying in his mind. His fingers found the keys, and a melody began to take shape, minor chords that spoke of grief and rage, progressions that built in intensity but never quite resolved. He played until dawn, pouring everything he couldn't say into the music. A week later, he took his quartet into a small recording studio and recorded the piece. No title, just the date, July 1968. He never played it in public, never included it on any album. It was too raw, too personal, a musical testimony that would have to wait for a time when the truth could finally be heard. In the Philadelphia Music Heritage Foundation auditorium, the silence was absolute as James finished his story. Decades of secrets finally spoken aloud. Rebecca was the first to break the silence. "Dad," she said, her voice small and uncertain. "Is this true?" Thomas nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "All of it. I confronted my father after James left that day. He denied it at first, but I knew. I could see James and myself in my father. The resemblance was too strong to ignore." "But you never reached out," James said, his voice tight with old pain. "In 50 years, you never once tried to contact me." "I wanted to," Thomas said. "God knows I wanted to, but my father threatened to disown me, to cut me off completely if I ever acknowledged you. I was a coward, James. I chose comfort over truth, and by the time my father died, so much time had passed, I didn't know how to bridge that gap." Marcus stepped forward, his lawyer's analytical mind processing the implications. "So that makes us cousins," Thomas said, looking between Marcus and Rebecca. "Your father and I share the same father, which makes you cousins." Sarah joined her brother on stage. "All these years we had family we never knew about." "I'm sorry," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I heard James's song on Rebecca's project when she told me she was featuring it tonight. I knew it was my last chance to make things right." James descended from the stage, moving slowly toward Thomas. The two elderly men stood face to face, half-brothers separated by America's racial divide, by choices made and not made, by silence maintained too long. "That melody," Thomas said quietly. "I recognized it. It was the lullaby our father used to whistle. You built your whole composition around it." James nodded, surprise registering on his face. "I didn't even realize. It was just in my head that night." "Blood memory," Rebecca said, understanding dawning. "That's why the song feels so personal yet universal. It's about family separated by race, about secrets and shared heritage despite division." "I never gave it that title," James said. "Never gave it any title. It was on the master tape when we found it in the archives," Rebecca explained. "Someone must have labeled it later." Elaine joined her husband, taking his hand. "It was me," she admitted. "When the record company asked for a title for the catalog years later, that's what I told them, because that's what you told me it was about, the memory that runs in our blood, even when we don't know our own history." James squeezed her hand, gratitude in his eyes. After a moment, he turned back to Thomas. "It's too late for a lot of things," James said. "But maybe not for everything." Thomas nodded, hope cautiously dawning on his face. "I'd like that." The audience watched in hushed reverence as the two elderly men embraced awkwardly, decades of separation beginning to melt away. It wasn't a Hollywood ending. Too much time had passed, too much hurt had accumulated. But it was a beginning. Rebecca wiped away tears as she watched her father and newly discovered uncle. Marcus put an arm around Sarah, both of them processing this revelation about their family history. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rebecca said, returning to the podium. "I think we've all witnessed something profound tonight, a testament to the power of music to reveal truth, to connect us across time and division. This is what the Philadelphia Music Heritage Foundation seeks to preserve. Not just notes on a page or recordings in an archive, but the human stories behind the music." As the formal ceremony concluded, the two families, along separated branches of the same tree, gathered in a private room. There were tears, questions, old photographs shared, resemblances noted. Rebecca and Marcus discovered they had attended the same college, just years apart. Sarah learned that Thomas had been a hobby pianist himself, though never professional like James. "All these years," Elaine said, shaking her head in wonder. "All these years we lived in the same city, shopped in the same stores maybe, and never knew." "I recognized you once," Thomas admitted. "At the Wanamaker's department store, Christmas 1972. James was with you and you had a little boy, must have been Marcus. I almost approached you, but I lost my nerve." What matters is now, Sarah said firmly. We can't change the past, but we can choose what happens next. As the evening wound down, James found himself alone with Thomas for a moment. That song, Thomas said, I never understood until tonight why it affected me so deeply when I first heard it on Rebecca's project. It felt familiar somehow. James nodded. Music speaks truths we sometimes can't put into words. I have his watch, Thomas said suddenly. Our father's pocket watch. He left it to me when he died. I'd like you to have it. James was silent for a long moment. Keep it, he said finally. But maybe someday you could show it to my grandchildren. Tell them where they come from, all of where they come from. Thomas's eyes filled with tears again. I'd be honored. Later, as the Wilson family drove home, a contemplative silence filled the car. Finally, Marcus spoke. Dad, are you okay? That was a lot. James stared out the window at the Philadelphia streets passing by, the city where both he and Thomas had lived separate lives for decades, carrying the same secret. I'm okay, he said finally. Better than okay. It's like I've been carrying a weight for 50 years and finally set it down. Why didn't you ever tell us? Sarah asked. About Edwin Morgan, about Thomas. James turned to look at his daughter. Pride at first, then habit, and after a while it just seemed too late. He reached for Elaine's hand. Your mother knew. She's the only one I ever told. And now everyone knows, Marcus said. That song you never wanted heard has connected you with family you never acknowledged. Life has a funny way of bringing things full circle, James said, echoing Elaine's words from earlier. Sometimes whether we want it to or not. When they arrived home, James went straight to his piano. His fingers found the keys, playing the opening bars of Blood Memory. But this time he continued beyond where he usually stopped, developing the melody in new directions, finding a resolution that had eluded him for 50 years. Elaine sat beside him on the bench, her head on his shoulder as he played. It sounds different now, she observed. James nodded. The story's different now, not finished, just different. As his fingers moved across the keys, James thought about Thomas, about Rebecca, about the strange ways that music could carry truth across time. The melody that had begun as an expression of pain and anger now transformed into something more complex, acknowledging the past while opening toward possibility. Outside, Philadelphia continued its night rhythm, a city of divided histories slowly finding ways to acknowledge its full, complicated story. Inside, an old song found its completion, the final notes hanging in the air like a question finally answered. Thank you for listening. If this story touched you, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.